All right. So I think we're good. Unfortunately, live streaming is out of the question for now because I do not know how to how to how to create from YouTube. Either that or it's just a confluence of events. The intersection of me not being that good with technology and YouTube getting functionally worse under the feminist leadership of Susan Wojcicki or Wojcicki, however you pronounce that, the latest censor at YouTube. YouTube's answer to Ellen Pao, the short-lived overseer of Reddit, or Chairman Pao, as her critics called her. But I'm gonna do this tape. This gonna record this video and upload it very shortly thereafter. After its completion, and you can, instead of contributing on the live stream, which I'm always fond of, you can reply in the comments section. So this is going to be a very informal pre-election video. Would have been a stream, which I intended it to be, but unfortunately we can't have everything. But I'm doing it after a conversation I had earlier with someone who mentioned my YouTube channel, and it made me realize that I'm kind of lackadaisical with the content creation. I haven't I do it's been getting more and more sparse. It used to be once every couple of days. Now it's once every week if you're lucky, and usually more like once every week and a half or 2 weeks. So I figured I might get this out since it's going to be the last video before Election Day. And I would say before the election is resolved, but unfortunately, we are facing the prospect of discussing this for the next several weeks, or several months in a worst case scenario. Now, hopefully, it is resolved within that 1 to 2 day time frame, which was how the 2016 election was decided and how the 2004 election was decided. Now, that, for those of you who don't remember, the state of Ohio was in flux up until very late that evening, and I think John Kerry didn't concede until the next day. So 2004 and 2016 were very late nights, but they were basically resolved by the next day. The 2000 election, on the other hand, was something that lasted, I believe, over nearly 2 months. I think it was resolved towards the end of December, if I'm not mistaken, by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that election involved lots of, well, they were described as, some of them were described as riots, like they had the Brooks Brothers riot, quote unquote riots, which was basically a bunch of Republican activists demanding that demanding to be let in, I believe, during one of the Florida recounts, but no one was injured. It really didn't constitute an actual riot, especially when you compare it to what's happened over the past 5 or 6 months, where you've had cities being burned to the ground. Portland has been under siege, and Seattle as well, for months. Those are actual civil insurrections. We didn't have anything like that in 2000, although there were a lot of confrontations and arguments. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people are nostalgic for that era, because even during it's almost kind of hilarious to think that the division was between Al Gore voters and George W. Bush voters, when philosophically there's very little cleavage there. I mean, other than there were some important tangible differences, for example, on abortion and a few other issues, but in terms of the direction of the country, it wouldn't have been drastically different if Al Gore had become president. Whereas now you have the Democratic Party, which has been essentially, depending on how you look at it, they've either been shanghaied by the far left identitarian movement, Black Lives Matter, or they've capitulated, or you could say they're simply utilizing them as a means of seizing power. It's kind of like how, and at the risk of invoking Godwin's law, I'll bring up the Nazis here for a moment. It's kind of like how Hitler cozied up to certain interests that were initially skeptical of the National Socialist Workers' Party. For example, industrialists, aristocrats, particularly these people who were very skeptical of Hitler's motivations, he would cozy up to them, and he would kind of use as a carrot the civil strife that was engulfing Germany at the time. The fact that, and the Nazis themselves were, in addition to being a reaction to to post-war Germany's economic problems, they were, I think, a much bigger pull factor was the fact that the communists were seizing power in large parts of Germany, the Bolsheviks, and they were out in the streets. They were attacking people, attacking businesses, and the Nazis used this as sort of a pretext to roll out their own campaign of counter intimidation or reaction. So Hitler would use these things in order to ingratiate himself with the elites and inveigle himself into the mainstream political culture of Germany at the time. And some people will look at what the Democratic Party is doing, Biden and Harris, as simply that, using these shock troops in order to intimidate and intimidate the quote-unquote normie, the normie vote, the people who just want peace and they want to get along with their lives. They want to be able to return to work. They want to interact with their family without masks. They're simply using these factions as a way of intimidating them into supporting the Democratic Party, which has some legitimacy, particularly if you look at the reactions. And a perfect example of this was a surprisingly good Reuters, and it's very rare I'll compliment the mainstream media, but there was a surprisingly good Reuters video online, which someone sent a link to this video to me and some other people, and I watched it, and I was actually really shocked that they crafted a really relatively fair presentation of Trump and Biden voters and their thoughts on the election in New York City, or New York State rather. And they talked to different voters, and some of them were pretty stereotypical. You know, they had the they had the stereotypical Biden voter who doesn't really like him, but despises Trump. And you had a very blue collar, I think it might have even been Staten Island or Long Island voter who was a very big MAGA supporter. But you also had a really interesting individual, this elderly man whose son served in Iraq, I believe, and was killed in he was KIA. He was killed in combat operations, if I'm not mistaken. And they talked to him, and he was actually it was really a fascinating interview, even though you only saw the 20-second or so soundbite from him. And what he said was essentially he's voting for Biden, and his reasoning was he just wants to return to normal. And this is actually a very common sentiment that I don't think people appreciate, particularly conservatives. I don't think they can relate to this sentiment. And Adam Carolla, believe it or not, who's sort of an old school liberal, a liberal kind of I guess you would call them, a liberal circa the 1970s, before wokeness became dogma within the Democratic Party. So he's a liberal like a rational liberal who opposes illegal immigration and the policies that have sort of destroyed the state of California. He analyzes public schools realistically and doesn't valorize public teachers unions like the NEA or the U. So he's kind of a rational liberal and politically incorrect, which is why so many on the left despise him, even though politically he's very far from being a reactionary or a right-winger. But they despise him because he goes against these dogmas on race, on gender relations, on things like immigration, which is the third rail of American politics. But he alluded to this in his most recent book, which is kind of a screed against political correctness and social justice activism, in a humorous way, of course, since he's a comedian. But he mentions this when he's a chapter which is exploring the Trump phenomenon, and he says, I don't have the book at hand, so I'm not going to quote him directly, but I'm paraphrasing. He says he writes something along the lines of, well, eventually people just want to return to normal. Trump, he says what everyone's thinking, and the people who are attacking him are out of their minds more often than not. But you can't do speed your entire life or something. I forget the metaphor he uses, but basically it's like people just want to return to normal. And again, this is someone who's saying this who's not necessarily a fan of Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, but he's expressing a widely held sentiment, which is that if Trump loses, then everything will go back to normal. Then there won't be riots. There won't be people just having meltdowns on national TV. But the thing that a lot of these people don't appreciate is that this has become institutionalized. I mean, I was replying to someone on Twitter the other day who brought this up, saying, wow, at least if Biden, I think this was a writer, I forget if it was the Hudson Institute, it was some conservative think tank, and he said, well, hopefully, if worst comes to worst, if worst comes to worst and Biden is elected, at least perhaps we'll get rid of these ridiculous COVID restrictions. And the implication is that Democrats, state governors, and mayors, and all of these Democrats in power locally will want Joe Biden to succeed and want the economy to succeed. Therefore, they'll rein it in. A lot of these things that were done as an expression of political opportunism, like shutting down entire states, these were done to sabotage Trump's chances. And to a large extent, that's correct. These were done specifically with the intent to harm Donald Trump, but I don't think people appreciate that giving these people power, entrusting amoral psychopaths with whose raison d'etre, their reason for being is to accumulate and retain power. That's their sole reason for being alive. And giving them power and then expecting them to yield or relinquish that power really is a fool's errand when you think about it. I mean, these people are not going... Do you think someone like Andrew Cuomo or Gavin Newsom, do you think any of these lunatics are actually going to cede the power that... forget the power that was given to them, the power that they seized illegally. I mean, Cuomo, or Governor Meatball, as Tim Dillon calls him, has seized so much power that even Marxists who are elected to the state legislature, like this fake Latino Senator Salazar, even they're saying we need to revisit this. We may, as a legislature, we may need to claw back some of these powers that the governor has seized. So I think it's kind of delusional to expect these people to just give back power, even if Biden is reelected. Now, in the short term, perhaps they might want to boost the economy in order to help Biden, but to think that the new normal is going to be abandoned, I think is really whistling past the graveyard. And I think that's one of the things people should consider when they go into vote on Tuesday. Now, there was a whole other... I was going to go into the polling. The people who still put their faith in polling units and how the collective amnesia of a large part of the public. But I didn't want to make this a long video, so I'll just leave it at that. Feel free to post in the comments who you think's going to win, what you think's going to happen, whether we're going to have a decision on election night or decision weeks later after the Supreme Court intervenes. I will see you next time when we might not have a president-elect, but the election will at least... election day will be over.